His presentation on short history of the chiefs of the Choctaw Nation from 1824 to 2026. It's actually going to go back a little bit further because the three big chiefs, the three important chiefs, all came into office around the year 1800. So we're actually a little bit predating this, but this is the time when they became most prominent. Okay, go ahead. All right, so we're going to start with the three great chiefs. These were Pushmataha, Pukshinabee, and Moshlatubi. Now, Pukshinabee, I purposely blurred that because that's probably not him. He died before there were any photographs or paintings made of him. There was a website that claimed that was him, but I don't think that it was. So I blurred it, so it's just there to represent him. This is Pushmataha, and that's Moshlatubi on the right. They were the heads of the three respective bands of the Choctaw Nation. Pushmataha was the head of the Oklahanawi, which means the people of the six towns, which was in the southern part of Mississippi. Pukshinabee was the head of the Oklafalia, who were in the western part and northern part. They were called the Long People, which referred to how they wore their hair. And then the Oklatanap was the group headed by Moshlatubi. They were called the Upper People. They lived in the eastern part of the nation. Sometimes I found some references that called them the Oklaahi Aplet, which means potato eaters, because apparently they would slice potatoes into small pieces, fry them, and store them during the winter, so maybe they invented potato chips. So that was just something I came across that I wasn't aware of. Pushmataha took over from the chief Yawani Bingo around the year 1800. Pukshinabee was in there prior to 1800, and Moshlatubi came in right around 1809 after the death of Homostubi. Okay, so those were the three main chiefs and the three bands. I'm going to give you some more information about them because these are probably the heart of the discussion for tonight. Pushmataha, during his time, met with the Shawnee leader Tecumseh, who was wanting to go to war against the national government of the United States, and he turned him down. And later on in treaty obligations, he always would stress the point, or discussions, he would always stress that the Choctaw people have never raised a hand against the Americans. We've never shed the blood of any American. We have been loyal. And that was always a really good bargaining point. They helped with the U.S. as allies during the War of 1812. He was born around 1764. He had his first fight against the Muskogee Creek people at around the age of 13. He traveled and saw the Osage and Caddo people and fought with them over deer herds in 1784 and 1789 in those years, and that would have been in Missouri, Arkansas, and East Texas. He took part in the negotiations for the Treaty of Mount Dexter in 1805 and met Thomas Jefferson at that time. During the war itself, he rose the rank of lieutenant colonel or possibly brigadier general. He and Andrew Jackson fought together against the Muskogee Creek in late 1813, and he was present at the Battle of New Orleans, where Moshlatubi really had his shining moment. He was the leader of the group of people who fought with Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans against the British, and his 52 Choctaw warriors probably picked off more of the British forces than any other units in the battle at that time. They would kind of sneak up on them at night, take them out one at a time, and then when the actual battle took place, they were under very, very good cover, picked off the advancing British soldiers, and their hiding place was never found during the battle. So both of them were very instrumental. Moshe Tubby had also turned down Tecumseh when he came to talk to his branch of the Choctaw people. Apuchinabe was older than the others. He had always kind of had trouble with the treaties that they signed over time because his people tended to lose land more often. So he was usually a lot more of what was going on. At the Treaty of Doak's Stand, Andrew Jackson was representing the U.S. government. These three chiefs were there representing the Choctaw Nation along with many others. Pushmataha was pressing for a removal of people that were squatting on the Choctaw land and was being hesitant about making the agreement. Jackson stood up in the middle of the meeting and said, "I am Andrew Jackson. I'm a general in the United States Army. I represent the United States government, and you will sign this treaty." And Pushmataha stood up and said, "I am Pushmataha, chief of the Oklahanali. I represent them, and I will not sign this treaty." So they was very determined, and they actually got what he asked for in the treaty. The treaty was signed, and Pushmataha got what he wanted. The big moment is going to come. Check the next slide here real quick. Okay, yeah, this is still more of that background that we were talking about that I was just going over. It gives the dates and the times. The four treaties that were signed from 1800 to 1816, the Choctaws just kept losing land with each treaty. Okay, now let's go on to the next one. The Treaty of Doak's Stand, which we talked about, that was signed in 1820, that granted them new land in Indian Territory. Originally, it was this land shown right here in this greenish color, which covered not much of Oklahoma, but a lot of Arkansas. And that was kind of a problem because, Arkansas Territory was already being formed. So there was a big dispute over that land, and there's going to have to be another treaty in 1824 to try and settle this boundary. And that's where we get to the fateful trip. This is the trip of 1824. The three chiefs, in September of 1820, the three chiefs and other high-ranking Choctaws would travel to D.C. to meet with Monroe, Jackson, and War Secretary Calhoun. Okay, go ahead, the next one. Okay, there's a mistake on that last slide. Shame on me, that should say 1824. Yep, so this was the big trip of 1824, and you can't change that now, but I'll change it later. Okay, so on their way, Apuchinabe, who had always been the most resistant to signing treaties, had a suspicious death along the way. They were in Kentucky. Apuchinabe was in his 80s, early 80s. And the story that was told was that they were staying in a hotel and he walked out on the balcony and fell off the balcony, which seems rather unlikely. Another story that was told about it was that he decided to leave the hotel and go swimming in September. And as he headed towards the creek to go swimming, he fell off the cliff and died. So again, pretty suspicious. The new leader of his group, the Oklafolai, was actually a member of the Oklotanip, who took over and was a lot more, he was half white and half Choctaw, and he was a lot more inclined to agree with the American government. So with Apuchinabe out of the way, the negotiations were going to be a bit easier. All right. Pushmataha, while they were in D.C., would get sick, and he would die on Christmas Eve. He was buried with full military honors. He was legitimately sick. He was in his 60s, and he just got sick and he died because there wasn't much medical care at the time. That is his grave in Washington, D.C. He's actually buried in Washington, and that's his marker. He was buried with full military honors as a U.S. General in the Army. So that leaves Moshe Tubby and the others that were stepping in to cover to work out the treaty. The Choctaws, in a later treaty in 1830, now that 1824 treaty, they just agreed to set new boundaries and change the border and give that land to Arkansas and give the Choctaws the land further west. But at that time in 1824, they were not obligated to leave. They said, you've got this land you can go to, but you don't have to go there. You can stay if you want. You can go if you want. You have more land. But this treaty is going to change that. The Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek of 1830. This is where the Choctaws agreed to removal to the west. The treaty would say they could stay if they wanted to, and they would lose their tribal membership, and they would become citizens and subject to the laws of the state of Mississippi. And as time went on, the ones who chose to stay, that didn't go very well for them. The three chiefs that negotiated that were Nitakichi, who was a nephew of Pushmataha, Greenwood LaFleur, who was a part French, part Choctaw. He had a French father and a Choctaw mother. In fact, when the removals happened, he remained in Mississippi, got elected to the Mississippi State Legislature, and died in Mississippi. So he would remain in Mississippi the rest of his life. David Folsom was representing the Moshlatubbee band, and he would come across along with Moshlatubbee, who was still alive at this time. He would come across to the new lands also, but Folsom was the leader at the time of the signing of this treaty. Moshlatubbee took over briefly after the removal was complete, but then he died, and he was also at a pretty advanced age at the time. David Folsom is buried at Fort Towson. Okay, so this is a map showing the land that they lost over time. The Fort Adams Treaty was the first one. In that one, they lost this land right here. In the Hoboken-Tupa Treaty of 1803, they lost this little piece of land right here. In the Mount Dexter Treaty signed with Jefferson, they lost the area in green, this area right here, the southern area. The forts, and there's another mistake, that should be a period, not a comma. Fort St. Stephen's Treaty, they lost the lands in yellow. They're now part of Alabama. The Treaty of Don't Stand in 1820, they lost all of this land in red, and all that was left was this blue area, which was given up by the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek of 1830. So with each treaty, they lost more and more land. Okay. Now, when they arrived at the new lands, the Choctaws set up a government system very similar to what they had back in Mississippi. They had three chiefs, three chiefdoms, and they named the three chiefdoms after each of those old chiefs. So the Moshlatubbee district was right here in what is now Pushmataha and McCurtain County and around Fort Towson. The Pushmataha district included what is now Hugo, Atoka, Cole County, Durant, this area. And the Apache district was this northern district up here, Poteau, Scullyville, McAllister, and all those northern areas. Okay. The Choctaws, when they came, agreed to share their land with the Choctaws. The Choctaw land actually went all the way across the state to the 100th degree of latitude. So the Choctaws actually owned all of this, but for a price, and the Chickasaws paid a pretty good price, they got all of this land out to the west. And they agreed to become the 4th district of the Choctaw Nation. And so for a time, the two tribes existed as one political unit. It wouldn't work out because the Chickasaws always got outvoted 3-1. So the Chickasaws eventually got tired of it, and after about 20 years, they petitioned the Choctaws for separation. a treaty was signed and they separated, and the Chickasaws became a separate nation. Okay. Now, from 1834 to 1857, there were a series of chiefs. These were the chiefs of, remember there were 3 chiefs for the tribe. These were the chiefs of the Pushmataha district. Nicotine chief for 4 years, Pierre Juzon for 3 years, Isaac Folsom for 5, Silas Fisher for 8 years, George Folsom, which again, notice, here's Folsom's over here, and David Folsom was the leader of the Moshlotubby group when they left Mississippi. So due to intermarriage, you're going to see a lot of this. David Folsom had actually married Pushmataha's niece. So there's a lot of intermarriage, and I was telling her earlier, as I got to researching this, there's a whole lot of family relations, and I could spend an hour just on the intermarriages and different relations and how they're all related to one another. This Thomas LaFleur that led the Apookshinubbies, he was the brother of Greenwood LaFleur, who remained in Mississippi. As you can see, he served 2 different terms, one for 4 years, one for 8 years, with James Fletcher and George Harkins on the other side. Nicholas Kokenauer was the last Pushmataha district chief. Over here, Moshlotubby was the first one, followed by Joseph Kincaid, John McKinney, then Nathaniel Folsom and his brother Peter Folsom, and then Cornelius McCurtain, the first of the McCurtain family to show up in this, and then the last one was David McCoy. But they all end, as you can see, in 1857. Why? Because they wrote a new constitution. The Choctaws wrote their first constitution in Mississippi in 1826 in a hope that by so doing, they would show the Washington government that they were completely civilized and were ready to live like civilized people. Well, when they got moved off anyway, they wrote a second constitution in Oklahoma, or Indian Territory, in 1838, the first constitution written here, and that's when they set up this system of government. But this system of government would come to an end in 1857. Okay. At that time, the Scullyville Constitution would be written, and they would agree to have a tribal governor instead of 3 chiefs. There would be 3 sub-chiefs, but the tribal governor would be the head of the government. And so the first one is Alfred Wade. He was the first tribal governor. The second governor was Tandy Walker. And the third governor was Basil LaFleur, who was a cousin to the other LaFleurs. This is right up in the years just before the Civil War. Wade very much pushed for a governor system. LaFleur pushed hard to switch back to a chiefdom. He wanted a chief system, so LaFleur and Wade didn't really like one another. Walker was just kind of a filler in between, but each of them just served for 1 year. And then they wrote a new constitution in 1860 called the Doaksville Constitution, in which they agreed to have one elected principal chief who would be elected to 2-year terms, and you could only serve 4 terms, and then you had to leave office. So they were term limited. Okay. So once they served with principal chiefs, the first, and we're going to go through these really quick because there's a lot of these guys, and if I spent too much time on any one of them, it might really run us over. So George Hudson was the first one. Now notice, these are all in place during the Civil War. So the Civil War was going on during this time, so there was a lot of turmoil, a lot of trouble, a lot of unrest in the Choctaw lands. But George Hudson was the first, and he signed the treaty where the Choctaws joined the Confederate States of America. Samuel Garland took over as the next chief, and then Peter Pitchlin, who had been pretty prominent in the tribe for a long time, became the third chief. He served, and then after he was done serving, he went back to Washington and just continued to work for the tribe in Washington for the rest of his life. Okay, now we get to the next three. Allen Wright. After the war and the peace treaties were signed, one of the things the United States government wanted the 5 tribes to do was to form a combined government. So they held yearly combined meetings in which they decided to do pretty much nothing. The only thing that they could agree on at any of their meetings, at the suggestion of Allen Wright, who lived over at Boggy Depot, he said, well, if we ever have our own state and our own land, I think we should call it Oklahoma, which, as we know, are the Choctaw words for red people. So he was the chief who suggested the name for Oklahoma. He was followed by William Bryant and Coleman Cole. Then the next, now it gets Isaac Garvin for just 2 years, and now the McCurtain family starts coming in and becoming very prominent. Jackson McCurtain was the elder statesman of the family. He ran things for 4 years, 1880, 1884, and the McCurtain family, a consistency with them was they wanted the land divided up. They didn't want to go back to the old ways of communal living. They wanted the land divided in severalty where each person got their own piece of land to live on. And the McCurtains were always very involved in that. Jackson McCurtain was the first. He served his 4 years, then was followed by his brother Edmund McCurtain for 2 years. But after that, the other side got prominence. These were the progressives also moved. He was kind of in line, and he was progressive. He wanted to change and be more like the open to dividing up the land and not living in the old ways. B.F. Smallwood, Benjamin Franklin Smallwood, came next. He was actually just the opposite. He wanted to stick with the old ways. He was a National Party member, and this is where you have 2 parties had merged among the Choctaws, the progressives who wanted to go forward and the nationalists who wanted to hold to the old ways. And you keep getting a back and forth in the leadership. So McKinney was there for 2 years, Smallwood was there for 2 years, and then you get Wilson Jones. He comes in, he represents the other side, and Wilson Jones is an interesting guy. He was a big-time cattleman over by Colgate. And at the time of his death, his estimated worth was $250,000. And that was in those days, which would be a tremendous amount of money today. But he was more of a progressive because he's going the other way from Smallwood. Okay, now we go back. So then we go to Jefferson Gardner, who was more of a nationalist, wanted to stick to the old ways, and then Green McCurtain gets back in. And he's the big guy. He serves his 2 terms. He's very much in agreement with the Dawes Act, the Dawes Commission, wanting to divide up the land, getting the people to own land, not collectively but individually. But he got to the end of his 4 years and he had to go. Well, he kind of installed Gilbert Dukes to continue his policies. But then Gilbert Dukes, during his 2 years in, decides, I don't think I want to be like you, Greenwood. Or Greenwood was his full name, Green is what everybody called him. And so Dukes, when it came time for re-election, the plan was, because you could serve 2 terms, right? Well, if you left, you could run again. So the agreement was Green was going to leave for 2 years, give it to Dukes, and then he was going to run again and take it back over. So Dukes was just there to hold the place until Green could come back. Well, Dukes ended up backing his opponent, a guy named Thomas Hunter. And this is that 1902 election that I've been teasing about. So, the election is held. The capital has been moved to Tuskahoma. Dukes is waiting at Tuskahoma for the votes to come in. Thomas Hunter, the guy Dukes is backing, comes and joins him at Tuskahoma. A U.S. Marshal gets invited to Tuskahoma, and Dukes declares Hunter the winner of the election. And the votes haven't got there yet. And Hunter sits down and starts drawing up the people he's going to put in office, his supporters that are going to get jobs for the nation now, that he's going to be in charge, and he's planning big things. Well, the tribal agent, which was a representative of the U.S. government, didn't like what was going on, so he sent a telegram to Fort Sill in Lawton. And 200 soldiers from Fort Sill ride to Tuskahoma. And when they get there, Green McCurtain is trying to get in the building. Dukes and Hunter won't leave the building. And the army gets there, and the commander of the army talks to both sides and said, all right, everybody get out. You're all going out until the votes are here and the votes are counted. So after they got kicked out, everybody's in the front yard at Tuskahoma having fistfights. And the army's just sitting there watching. And then the votes came in that night, and the winner is Green McCurtain. He gets reelected. And he ends up serving his 2 terms till 1906, and then statehood is coming. And the laws have been passed that went into effect in 1906, basically shut down the tribal governments. There were no more tribal governments. There was no more House of Kings, no more House of Warriors. There would just be a chief, and he's just there in name only. And he's appointed by the president. Well, Green McCurtain gets appointed by Theodore Roosevelt to be the first ceremonial chief of the tribe. So he stays for the last 4 years as a nation, and then for the next 4 years as an appointee of Theodore Roosevelt. He's then replaced by Victor Locke, who was nominated by William Taft. This was after Taft and Theodore Roosevelt had their falling out. So Taft was determined to put in people that were more loyal to him in these ceremonial positions. And the one thing about Victor Locke, he looks a lot like Stan Stamper. That struck me when I found that picture. But Victor Locke lived between Hugo and Antlers. He's buried at a little cemetery just up on the highway north of the airport. We've been to that one. That one where you have to get permission to go in the gate? Yeah. Anyway, we'll talk about that another time. Okay, so that is Victor Locke. Then we get a Democrat president, so of course he has to put a Democrat Choctaw in the office, and that's William Semple. He goes in 1918, stays till 22. Whoa, that's a mistake. Again, I made 3 mistakes, because that's an overlap. How did I do that? Okay, so Harrison actually comes in 22, not 1920. He's appointed by Warren Harding, and basically it was because Harding forgot to do anything. Harding was a very bad president and didn't pay attention to a lot of things, and so this kind of slid for a couple of years, and then in 22 he appoints William Harrison. And Harrison turned out to be a pretty good guy. Hang on, back up. I forgot William. Oh yeah, we got William Semple. Okay, we're good. He was young, he was a lawyer, he was very efficient. Okay, Harrison, had worked with Green McCurtain during his time, so he was an old McCurtain guy, and he ran things. Again, not much was going on. It was more of a ceremonial position. Ben Dwight was the next one to be appointed. He was appointed by Herbert Hoover. He was the best educated of all of these old chiefs. He had started out at Jones Academy as a boy. He then went to Armstrong Academy over by Bochita. He then went to public school at Caddo and graduated from high school at Honeygrove. He went to college at Columbia University in New York and got a Bachelor of Arts. He worked on his master's degree at both the University of Michigan and OU, and eventually got a doctorate of law from Stanford University in California. So he was by far the most educated of the tribal leaders. And basically because of his education, his great abilities, Roosevelt, even though he had been appointed by a Republican, kept him in until Dwight was ready to move on. William Durant was the next one. He had been a Speaker of the Choctaw Council. He had also been a Speaker of the Oklahoma House of Representatives. The only person to be both. He created the bill while he was in the Oklahoma House of Representatives that created Southeastern. He also is the one that has family that's buried here in Choctaw County. His uncle started the city of Durant, and that's the Durant family. All right, then we have Henry Belvin, who was appointed by Harry Truman. He has the longest service of any of the Choctaw Chiefs. He was in there for 27 years. He also, while he was chief, served in the Oklahoma House of Representatives and the Oklahoma State Senate. So he was doing both at the same time. The termination policy introduced by the U.S. government in the 1950s that was going to completely end the tribal nations again, he fought against, and eventually he was successful, and the Choctaws became reestablished as a tribe in 1970 with free elections for the chief among their own people, and he ran and won his term. But by that time he was getting up in years, so he moved on and was replaced by David Gardner. David Gardner was very, very young. He wanted the tribe to restore Tuscaloosa to what it had been. He started the process of moving the tribal offices to Durant. He was only in for 3 years. He contracted cancer and died at the age of 37, but had been a very, very good chief during the years that he was in. He was replaced by Hollis Roberts, who was in there for 19 years. He continued Gardner's policies of redoing Tuscaloosa, establishing the tribal offices. He did a lot of things to help the growth of the tribe and the nation until he was forced out of office by a vote of the tribal council for some crimes that he had committed. Okay, I had to figure out how to word that. But he also expanded the voting membership among the tribe. He granted women the right to vote. He got 2 new constitutions written during his time that greatly helped the people of the Choctaw Nation. He was followed by Gregory Pyle. He had been the assistant chief for 13 years. He oversaw a lot of gaming expansion and growth within the Choctaw Nation and did a very good job as chief until he retired. He announced his retirement at his 65th birthday party. And then his assistant, Gary Batten, who had been the assistant chief for 13 years, took over and has been the chief ever since. In the first election where he ran for chief, he received 86.5% of the vote. In the 2 most recent elections for Choctaw chief, nobody has run against him. So he's done a very good job. He's very popular among the Choctaw people. And that gets us to today. Do we have any questions?
This is one of my personal opinions. If I had fought for the United States like the Choctaws did, And then the famous General Jackson, or the President Jackson, turned his back on them and made them leave their lands. I think I would have been angry.
Yes, you're quite right.
But still, they came. They were put in the position. So I've always admired them for doing that, but I think President Jackson was a terrible, terrible president.
I would agree with you on that. Go back to that very, very first slide real quick, because that's something I did not mention. Yeah, it's going to be up a ways back. So that trip that we talked about, it was after they arrived in Washington, a painter was commissioned to paint Pushmataha and Moshwatubby. He also painted many, many other native leaders. The Smithsonian Institute has a collection of over 120 paintings that he made of Native Americans. It's the best record that we have of what they would have looked like during that particular period of time. The paintings of Osceola, the paintings of I can't remember his name, the other leader of the Seminoles. But he had made many, the painting of Sequoia that we're so familiar with. That same painter did all of those paintings. And while they were on that trip, not only did they get painted, they met with President Calhoun, and they met with a very, very old General Marquis de Lafayette from France, who was making his last visit to the United States prior to his death, to see how the country had been after he had helped them out. And Pushmataha and Moshwatubby both met with Lafayette, and that was really neat. They also met with President Monroe and the Secretary of War, John C. Calhoun. And of course, Jackson was around for that one too. But, okay, any other questions? That's it. Thank you very much for your time.
Good job.